Oh, go ahead. Do you think? Should we? Yeah, do you think she'll want to talk about those or should I talk about it? Well, you did the beginning. I'll mention it, yeah, and she can reference. They're gonna be one meeting to win. When I do the intro, I'll grab it and I'll set it there. Well, good morning. Oh, good morning. Good evening, everybody. It's been a day. I'm the, I guess, still relatively new Associate Director and Director of Education. My name is Valerie Wasmer. And this is the biggest crowd we've had so far. I'm really excited. We have about 20 people on our Zoom right now who are watching from home. When I started the job in June, I knew one of my responsibilities was to line up interesting speakers for our Thursday night lecture series. And so I started researching and I thought, well, what would I be interested in? And I immediately found Susan Bartlett Foote's book about the Rochester and other Minnesota state hospitals. And I knew I had an interest, and so I knew other people would have an interest as well. And this clearly shows us right. So we do, for those of you who are not familiar, we do a Thursday night lecture series. I think I've done 9 since I started in June. So I've been told to slow down a little bit. So I will. I'm happy to do so. But like I said, this is the biggest crowd we've had. I'm so excited. Those of you that are members of the Historical Society, we have many here. So thank you for that. If you are a member here at HCOC, any of our programming like this is completely free. So I have to put that shameless plug in for membership to the Historical Society. Yay! So, you know, if there's 3 or 4 of these every month and it's $5 each time, it's going to pay for itself, right? So if you're interested in membership, we've got some information on the way out. So shameless plug complete. Support your local history society. Why we're all here, right? I'm super excited. Susan Bartlett Foote, as we know, is the author of this amazing book, The Crusade for Lost Souls. I have my copy on the back table there. Just a bit of background, Professor Emerita at University of Minnesota with public health, right? Widely published in her field. And the author of 2 books, both to critical acclaim. The first one I have to read off the page because I never remember it. Managing the Medical Arms Race, Innovation and Public Policy in the Medical Device Industry. That's way too smart for me. So that's one book. But again, The Crusade for Forgotten Souls is an incredible book. Those of us who have read it don't just think so. It has won some awards. The 2019 Minnesota Book Award for the best nonfiction book. And the Midwest History Association, also in 2019, granted the Hamlin Garland Prize for, quote, an engaging, sympathetic, and scholarly examination of how Minnesota sought to improve the treatment of its citizens in mental institutions. And for anyone that has read the book, it's a very balanced accounting of both like the records and the sort of research side, but also very, very humanizing, telling about, well, there's one sort of central character that weaves a very empathetic story about what was happening in our state institutions, including the second one here in Rochester. So I've talked enough. Please welcome Susan Bartlett Foote. And I forgot to mention one thing, because I know you'll probably come back to it. Our collections agent today went through our, some of our objects in our collections, and we have several straight jackets that are actually from the Minnesota State Hospital here in Rochester. And I don't know if you're gonna expand on that a bit.
Well, the name they used was camisole, which is a little bit of a euphemism for the hideous nature of that.
Full tank top, but not so much. So I'll put it back over here, and if, you know, you're welcome to gently take a look at these. They are in our collection, so we have to be a little careful, but it's kind of a nice image.
I have a picture coming up of someone in one of those, so you can see how they work.
All right, take it away.
Okay, this is terrific. I'm so glad to be here and to tell this story of people that I love and admire so much and have lived with me in the process of researching this book, writing this book, and talking about this book. So it's the story of ordinary people who broke through the stigma of shame, exposed the terrible conditions, and put the mental hospital reform on the political agenda in 1948. They persuaded the governor, who at the time was Luther Youngdahl, to take up the cause. Anyone remember Luther Youngdahl? Yeah, we're all getting up there. We don't remember 1948. To take up the cause, were his strongest allies and trusted advisors, and built a statewide citizens movement, which was the first time ever something like mental health was out of the shadows and actually was a statewide movement. A lot of it of mothers and families across the state who felt empowered to speak up. Their work, they wrote much of the state legislation these people I'll be talking about, worked tirelessly and effectively for years to get it passed. And it catapulted Minnesota to the forefront of mental health reform. And Luther Youngdahl, the Minnesota governor, was honored by all sorts of psychiatric societies and so on. Minnesota was really the leader of reform. I've given talks like this throughout the state over the past few years, and I'm always curious when I do to just find out a little bit about the audience and their interest. Is there anyone here who had a connection to Rochester State Hospital? Just raise your hand. Were you worked there or?
No, my uncle was a patient there for a long time.
Okay,
As a kid, we go with him.
okay.
My sister-in-law was at the state hospital.
And you have any, yeah? So yeah,
I actually did an internship with, in the, section with people with special needs, the mental handicaps.
interesting.
I have someone on our Zoom saying it's difficult to hear you, so do
Okay.
you mind? I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, it certainly affected the city of Rochester, but it affected lots of people all over the state. I didn't look for this story. It found me. In 2013, I was newly retired and I was helping my son move. You know how you do that. And I was cleaning out a closet and this bag, you know, just a grocery bag, paper bag, fell on my head, literally. And I looked in it and there was a scrapbook of clippings from the 1940s, some speeches typed on an old manual typewriter, you know, that onion skin, remember that? Some graphic photos, including some of these I'll show tonight, and reports all about mental health reform in the 1940s. And why did my son have it? They were the papers of his grandfather, Arthur Foote, who's in this story, who was a minister at Unity Unitarian Church in St. Paul from 1945 to 1970. And he died in 1999. And these were his papers that he had saved through his lifetime. And his daughter sent him to my son because he lived in St. Paul and she didn't. And she said, oh, here's some Minnesota stuff from your grandfather. Well, he didn't know what to do with it, my son. And so he put him on the top of the closet until they fell on my head 13 years later. And going through those old papers and photos, and I'm an old historian by just preference, I felt in my bones there was a story. It was a really funny reaction. It's a forgotten story, and to the extent anyone remembers this bit of Minnesota history, it's Luther Ljungdahl, the Swedish Republican Lutheran governor. I gave a talk in California and I said that nobody reacted. I said, when you say that in Minnesota, they know exactly what kind of guy he was. So 4 years of research and writing later, which I have to say were the most exciting time of my life. It was just such a wonderful search. I found the story of these ordinary people who made a difference in the world. So tonight I want to give you a taste of the story, but you know, there's lots of the detail in the book, but also really the people, these incredible people who were the ones who brought this reform to life. But just as a little bit of background, let's see if I can operate all the technology. There were 7 state mental hospitals here in Minnesota in the 1940s. And these are some examples. There's Fergus Falls, which was the largest building after the Pentagon up to the Mississippi River. Huge, and it's still standing. It's abandoned. They can't figure out what to do with it, but it's there in Fergus Falls. This lower one, Anoka, gives you a sense of another kind of architectural design. Clarence Johnston, the famous architect, did these, what they called cottages. They were built around in a circle. And they preferred that method to the big buildings simply because they could expand very easily and cheaply. They just would build another cottage. So that was the cottage model. Faribault, I just put in there because it was another kind of hospital. It was for the, what they called them, the mentally defective imbeciles at the time. And then there's a picture of Rochester. And it's a postcard somebody sent. They had a lovely time in Rochester. I don't know whether he just bought that at the grocery store or the drugstore or what, but it gives you a sense of the incredible size and complexity of these institutions. And another, these were the conditions at the time we're talking about. There's the deployment of the straitjackets. And you can see that there were leather straps holding their feet to the bench. There's pictures of food. This is a ward, often so crowded that they couldn't get out of bed. They had to climb over the end of the bed because there was no room between the beds. And then this is a picture that is from Rochester, which is a bathroom. You can see the nature of the conditions at the time. So who were in these institutions? In Minnesota, there were about 15,000 Minnesotans incarcerated in the 1940s, 80% who were involuntary, who were committed by family members. And committed was a legal process that meant you were a ward of the state and your family had no longer any kind of custodial or connection, couldn't get you out. You belonged to the state. and they were adjudicated insane. The other thing that's heartbreaking is about 30% of these people were senile elderly. They had no place to go. There was no options if the family couldn't manage to care for them. It was our long-term care system. Some others were misfits, the brother nobody liked and they didn't want him to get the farm, and maybe he wasn't as bright as the others, there those kinds of things. Inconvenient wives, people family wanted to be rid of, people with transient problems, grieving widows were often the family wanted their stuff and send them away. And those with advanced syphilis, which created problems with the brain, and then they were crazy. And the rest had a whole range of disorders we would now identify as mental illness, from mild or temporary to severe. And the feeble-minded imbeciles were crowded into another massive institution with no training, restrained, underfed, and ill-clothed. And these institutions touched, and I've seen that now, even all these many years later, far more than those thousands who existed inside the walls. Families suffered too. There was terrible shame. Some of you I just talked to here doing research, they were family secrets. There were relatives nobody knew about because nobody wanted to talk about it. An uncle or a grandmother or a child of a neighbor who got sent away and only spoken of in whispers. So that was the condition. And the research shows that Minnesota was among the worst. These models of buildings and this kind of approach to mental health was similar all over the country, but it was expensive. And if you only give pennies a day and you pay extremely low wages and understaffed and so on, you get a really tragic situation begins to build. And it's also important to remember the time. It was post-depression and wartime, and there wasn't money. There wasn't a lot of money in the state coffers for lots of things, including the mental hospitals. But at the time of this story, there were stirrings of national awareness that was started by, it's so interesting, conscientious objectors to World War II. A lot of the people who'd worked worked in the institutions were drafted. They needed people. And so these conscientious objectors were assigned to work in mental asylums. Not many in Minnesota, but in Illinois and a few other states. They were, for the most part, educated young men and, humanitarian in the sense, and they organized. And their concern led to this expose in Life magazine in 1946. And I know, because I remember, a lot of you remember Life magazine. When that magazine came, that was your picture on the world. There was no, we didn't have a TV I didn't have a TV in the 40s, that was it. That was in the pictures and the photographs, and that was news for people. If you saw those pictures, and some are in the book, horrifying pictures, big expose. In Minnesota, the powers that be, the governor, the state officials, the superintendents, suppressed the facts and controlled the message. And so the Pioneer Press ran a story a few months after the Life magazine expose saying, "No snake pits in Minnesota. All is well here in Minnesota," and repeating the party line that the people are well cared for and that negative stories upset the families needlessly. And of course, we could use more money, but trust us to spend it. So I wondered how this movement, how did it start? And how did these Unitarians, who are kind of a sect, really, of, 2,000 people in the whole state. So I had all these pictures and all this stuff, trying to make sense of it. And the first thing I did was, because Youngdahl got all the credit, is there's one biography of him called A Christian in Politics. So I got that biography. And in it was this interesting line. It said, "It all started with Engla Shea, an attendant in mental hospitals." And I later learned Engla means angel in Norwegian. And like, who's that? Never heard of her. So I asked myself, who is this person that apparently started it all? I started digging in census records and land records and town histories, and then I began to look for relatives. She had never married, but she had 2 sisters and a brother. And boy, that Minnesota Historical Society. Yay, historical societies, right? You got the old newspapers where they told what everybody did in the town, and I found a few relatives, like using Facebook, and wedding records in newspapers and things like that. And a few months later, a great niece of this Angla Shea wrote me and said, she lived in Weyauwega, Wisconsin. And she said, "I have Angla's papers, including all of her diaries." And I have a Norwegian friend, and I said, "We're going." And we drove in a blizzard to Weyauwega, Wisconsin with our printers in the back so we could make copies. And it was incredible. And when you read the book, you'll see Angla's power as a writer. And it raised, just chills on your spine reading about the patients. And so it was like, can I find out more about this woman? And here she is. There's the homestead, the classic Norwegian immigrant in northern Minnesota, Marshall County. And that's the mother and father and her beloved grandmother. And there's a lot about her beloved grandmother in the book. And there's her family, her father and mother seated, and then the 4 children, and she's the one behind her dad. And there she is much later in Minneapolis in 1938. And she's one of the heroes in this story. How did she become this, starting it all when her background, she had nothing. It was a really impoverished background. So I began to try to figure out, who is this person? She was born in 1895 for a Norwegian family, very bright, adored her father, who was a free thinker, not a thing you want to be in northern Minnesota in 1900. Her mother was a fire and brimstone, mother would open, this is in her diaries, open the oven with the flame and say, "That's where your father's going to end up because he is a sinner." So so she was her daddy's girl, and she had a big heart and an open mind, and she wanted to help people. And she joined the Salvation Army, which is what a lot of Scandinavian, I see people nodding their heads, with sort of not ambition to be successful, but to do something positive. It was acceptable to do that. So she joined the Salvation Army, and she wrote that she appreciated their non-judgmental assistance and get it done attitude. No judgment. You need food, we get you food. And so you get a feeling for this wonderful young girl who had a very troubled childhood. The father lost the farm. There was a lot of trauma in the childhood. And then in 1928, her father, her adored father, checked himself into Fergus Falls State Hospital and was suicidal and in a deep depression. And in one of her stories, this is what she wrote. She's visiting the dad in Fergus Falls. "The years can't change things between us, Dad. We still understand each other," wept the daughter. "Dad, don't you remember?" pleaded the daughter. "Daddy's girl, you used to say." "Do you mean to say all that has changed?" she said, wiping the tears from her eyes. "I don't want to remember it. I want to forget the past," he sighed. "All my life, I have been so alone." That night, she tried to piece together her father's tragic life and cursed fate that it should have dealt thus with such a wonderful man. Then her mind went back again to the quotation she used to answer the roll call with in grammar school. "Do something worth living for, do something worth dying for, do something to show there's a mind, heart, and soul within you." Almost accidentally, this is still her writing, she had stumbled on a cause that was bigger than herself, her father, and her entire family, and it made her happy. So this is this beautiful, it's a beautiful soul that she had. So there she was, that was her decision. So she returned to Minnesota. She had been doing social work in Missouri or something. And what she said, crashed the gates, and was hired at Anoka State Hospital as the lowest level attendant, which was, the lowest you could be, a custodial job. And there's lots of quotes I could read because she kept these diaries throughout her career. But here's just one to give you a sense. "I refused to put a patient in camisole right off the bat. And I took a patient who had crouched like a dog on a leash, tied in a 6-stool toilet out on a porch. And I objected to camisole patients having all of their supper, including dessert and liquid, served in a tin bowl and scooped into them like slopping the hogs. So I got off to a bad start." So you begin to see this person, but how does she then start it all? It's really an incredible story of a true heroine. So first she started by trying to change things from within. She took courses at the university. At this point, she's at Anoka. She was denied opportunities for responsibility or promotion. She had tried hard to change from within, and then decided, maybe if I go to a different hospital, it'll be better. And that's when she decided that she would try to get to Rochester, which had this reputation of being better than Anoka. And it took her a long time to get approval. They didn't like people changing around and stuff like that. These were pretty authoritarian institutions. The staff were not given a lot of privileges. But she came to Rochester, and it was better as a physical place. The superintendent was someone named Magnus C. Peterson. Anyone related to him? There's some people in here, you say some negative things and you hope that it isn't their granddaughter in the audience. But even at Rochester, it was difficult to get training. She wanted better training. And they told her that she could if she came to Rochester, and then she was assigned the wards when the classes were, and she couldn't go. But there are a few things that I thought, because this is a Rochester audience, that might be interesting. On Rochester being better. It had more staff. It had the benefit of Mayo Clinic. In many of these institutions, there were no doctors. The one in Anoka had severe Parkinson's disease and couldn't really treat anybody. That was the only doctor that anyone could see. Mayo provided, and there was a nascent interest in psychiatry that began to grow because of the soldiers coming back from the war with serious PTSD, not called that then, but different kinds of problems. And Peterson knew how to work the system politically to get adequate or more funding than Anoka, that had a kind of ineffectual character as the but I got to read this because he was manipulative. He was smart. He was full in charge, Dr. Peterson. But here's him. Peterson boasted of his political skills. Around the time of Engla's arrival, a legislative building committee was on its biennial tour to evaluate the needs of the institutions. So here are the legislatures, walking around. The procedure, especially in the lean war years, was to shine the place up to impress the legislators how wisely funds were being used. Engla experienced such visits at Anoka, where the distinguished visitors were quickly steered to the selected cottages that had been specially prepared for them to see, then whisked away to see the farm operations, more familiar territory for rural legislators. Dr. Peterson, however, decided to shock rather than impress his visitors. He arranged for an evening visit, waiting until patients were in bed, some needing a change of sheets, and then toured the committee members through dark, overcrowded, and smelly wards. Of this shocking tour, Peterson was the midnight ride was to Paul Revere. So, so there were differences among these institutions based on how they could manipulate the system, where they were located, trying to jostle some money out of the legislators. The downside of Peterson was that he was a huge fan of electroshock. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but thousands of patients were shocked, including some on admission, just to do it. And that was one of the things that he made, and he loved lobotomies too. So that was scientific, you see. So here's Engla. She gets to Rochester. They won't let her get more training. It is a better place, but it's not good. And she decides to get involved. And she got wind of those conscientious objectors who had created an organization in 1946 to publicize the problems. She jumped on the bandwagon and said in her diaries, began spreading the gospel of mental health reform. And she'd had 13 years in the Salvation Army and said at one point she knew how to spread a gospel. So she started hitchhiking from Rochester's and buttonholing people. And she had identified liberal religion, writers, and unions as fertile ground to spread the word. And the conscientious objectors had some materials. And she went to her own minister, who happened to be at a Unitarian church, and hit him up for money and to buy and distribute materials. She was very frustrated because she got nowhere, but she continued to try to. But in October of 1946, this Unitarian Society, this reverend who was her minister, invited her to this conference, this Unitarian conference, because the group had decided that they wanted to do something because the world was in such bad shape in 1946, and this group church group said, we want to contribute to doing something, better, to make the world better. And it usually focused on church matters. But now they were talking about how do you do something? And the planners had selected mental health. And Angela was the only true insider at this conference. And it was really hard. I mean, she couldn't just take the day off. It was really hard for her to get off and get up there and hitchhike. And at this meeting, she gave frank and graphic disclosures of what really goes on there. And I found some of that writing both in her diaries and then in some of the Unitarian descriptions of their meeting, of this this attendant who basically said, this is how it really is, despite what you read in the newspapers. And that was a key dramatic moment in the book. And I think it was some of the people among these Unitarians who took on this project that told Luther Youngdahl, the biographer of Luther Youngdahl, she started it all. And then the story goes on about how this group of Unitarians took on this task, and how they developed a strategy, a political strategy. Get the facts. Don't just, raise your fist. Study. Go deeply. Find out what other states are doing. Actually go to the institutions and so on. And so there's a whole part that's more like a political strategy of how they carefully and very carefully tried to put it together. And there was a woman, I won't go into great detail, who was a woman of action, who actually made the trains run on time with all this political effort. And she helped organize the response. The other, see, I get talking, I forget all these pictures. There's Arthur Foote. He was the minister who developed the strategy, and after a year of study, they went public with their concerns. And this is this fabulous woman. You have to read about her. I don't have time to talk about her, but she was the one who made it all work. And I first, when I read about her, she went to Radcliffe. She was married to a professor. I thought, oh, what Angela would have called, because she called some people those grand ladies of St. Paul. But in her background, she was a poor Irish immigrant family. Her father died. Her mother was in a mental institution. She was in a foster home. And when I got her Radcliffe transcript, the information went to a name I'd never heard, and it turned out it was a social worker. So she was just like Angela, but she had been saved by chance, and she was educated, and she could participate in a way that Angela, the poor attendant, never would be allowed to do. So it's a really interesting sort of how women manage, and she managed. She later became big in the Henry Wallace campaign, and she worked with Hubert Humphrey until she didn't support him, and then he was mad at her. But she was a force to be reckoned with. So she's another one of these are the kind of women that we ought to know about. And then the third is a woman, her name then was Jerry Hoffner. She just died at age 101, I think. She was, you might have heard her name. She was Jerry Joseph as a married person, a big Democratic organizer in her later life. But here she was a 23-year-old graduate of the U, majored in journalism. She decided she wanted to work for the New York Times. I mean, this is like 1948, 47. Like, you know, but she ended up working for the Star Tribune, called the Tribune, I think, at the time. And she was just this young, brilliant, beautiful, hardworking person. She wanted to do in-depth stories. And Arthur Foote, who was the political, trying to do the political change, asked her to do like an expose. She went to the head of the paper, and the editor said, you have to tell the governor that you're going to do that because these are public institutions. An olden time where there was a lot of respect for everybody else's institutional requirements and stuff. And she went to the governor, and the governor said, if you do that, I will have your job. So when she told me, and I got to interview her, she's an incredible woman. And I even gave a book talk at Shalom Home where she was living. And she came, and she was like 99. And she spoke to the group about her memories. She's another incredible one. I was like, why would the governor say that? He was like the big leader. Why would he say, I'll get you fired if you do that? And it turned out he had learned of all sorts of horrible things that were happening in those institutions and being covered up by his own people. And so it was a real tricky deal. Then Arthur Foote gave a big speech, sort of launching the effort for reform. And Youngdahl didn't like that at all and called Reverend Foote into his office to give him the once over. And in another dramatic moment, after discussing it, Youngdahl said, it's political dynamite if I take this on. And Arthur said, and I've got all this documented, it's only political dynamite in hands other than your own. And Luther Youngdahl, who had a big heart, he was also very moral, realized if he took on the issue and owned it, he could make changes. If he denied it and fought it, he couldn't. And that was the combination of Jerry Joseph, Arthur Foote, speaking to Luther with knowledge and not you're a bad guy, but this is something you can do. And he took it on. And he's the one who called it the Crusade for Forgotten Souls. The rest of the book talks about that crusade and the role that these various people and others played in a multi-year battle to expose the problems and inform the legislature, and most importantly, to organize people. And it's so exciting to see in all these towns. And it was frankly mostly women who had dealt with some of these, they couldn't care for people, or, they knew. And they put together a program, they did research, they wrote the legislation, and change happened. Now that there were several legislative sessions, and some of the problems later emerged, but there was a major bill in 1948, and there's Luther Youngdahl signing the bill. And here, and this is how I'll end it, there's Luther Youngdahl at Anoka State Hospital burning the straitjackets. And those are the people in the story, and the book will give you much more richness on the details also of the reform and lots of the political ins and outs and the challenges they had. And then the last is Dr. Ralph Rawson, who's a wonderful physician who had been the superintendent of Hastings State Hospital, was the one who took over within the government to effectuate the reform. Just in conclusion, let's see. Just simply, the reform effort basically was the inherent dignity and value of every human being. And that's something that's a lesson for us always. We, and that ordinary citizens can inspire. Unfortunately, the vision of those reformers is still unmet. But the legislation embodied, and this is the terms they used back in 1948, fundamental human guarantees. Fundamental human guarantees to all people. And this crusade, I think, as when you finish it, reading it, the details, is an inspiration and an admonition. The inspiration beyond mental health to all reform efforts, what a community can do if it puts its mind to it and its heart in it. But there's lots of political pitfalls, and I'll end with the words of Luther Youngdahl, as true tonight, I think, as they were spoken in 1954. Protection of the patient depends upon our eternal vigilance. Thank you. We have time for some.
We absolutely have time for questions. She's graciously agreed to
Sure.
Discuss or answer any questions that you might have. I think you wanted to take a seat though. Is that
Yeah, it helps me because I.
I'll just
I'm a bad lady.
that everyone at home
It's hard to see.
can hear you. And I'll repeat the question also for the people at home
Okay.
if
That's okay.
fire when ready. Questions, comments, anything?
I got one. We moved here 30 years ago, but on Highway 14 west of town, close to Dodge Center, was there a building out there that was considered, somebody told me at one time, years ago.
I'm just gonna repeat the questions for the folks
Yes,
at home.
I don't.
Was there, and Wayne, maybe you know, was there in Rochester out on 14 West
Yeah, close to Dodge.
by
Center.
Dodge Center? Was that part of the Rochester campus? I've never heard anything along those lines, maybe.
No.
Was it?
It
a-
was the poor farm.
Oh,
It
it was
was-
Fairview Nursing Home.
Fairview Nursing Home, otherwise known as the Poor Farm?
No.
No.
I think I heard it was a seminary.
Seminary?
Maybe we're not thinking of the same building.
no,
It's on the
it
north
was on
side
the
of the-
north side.
Yeah, and I think at one point in its history, it was a seminary.
It was seminary for that too.
A seminary. Thank
So
you.
not connected to the hospital.
Wow, I was always curious.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. It's nice to have experts in the audience. What other questions, comments, anything else that Dr. Foote can answer?
Where were the indigenous people placed into which institution?
The question is
Were they
about
part of,
indigenous population.
I didn't see any reference to any indigenous groups in the hospitals.
Hmm.
There must have been. They maybe separate ones. I don't know.
maybe they were shipped to North Dakota?
I don't know.
That could be.
I think so.
Yeah, Angela writes about the few Black patients that she encountered. There's lots of patient stories in the book. But I don't really know. Who knows where people got shipped?
What year did they close the Rochester State Hospital?
Oh,
1982.
82, yeah. And that's a whole different part of mental health history. When I started working on this book, people thought, oh, well, that's when they closed all the hospitals. But no, this was an effort to make the hospitals places of healing and safety and decency, and not to close them. And the closing of hospitals was in the 70s and 80s. And the way they talked about it then was, well, the community will take care of people. And the funds never came, and the communities didn't, and the hospitals were gone. And when I talk about this in general in California with the homeless problem, and most of those people are mentally ill or drug addicted, and then the same issue comes up. Do you put them away? And what do you do with them when you put them away? I mean, the social issues we face are very similar to the ones. And, many people who worked in the hospitals were not evil people. That, that was the option. And that was what we did.
I work in a group home with an individual, that's there, and he was in one of these state hospitals. And he was placed there at about the age of 12. And the behaviors that we see and the things that he suffered
Wow.
are very, very visible today, and he is 68 years old.
Wow.
And that's why I'm watching this.
Yeah.
Back in,
Was he at Cambridge?
I thought he was at St. Peter, but I think he might have been at Faribault.
Okay, because Faribault had children.
Yes.
And they were-
When I spoke with him.
Yeah.
I think it was Faribault.
Yeah, and they were mental defectives, and they were hungry, and
He's
yeah,
got mental retardation, and he's the sweetest man.
yeah,
In fact, things that he faced and things that we know about. And
yeah,
and he's not very verbal.
yeah,
But yeah, terrifying.
Yeah.
And very upsetting.
yeah. There were hundreds of letters in Luther Youngdahl's files from citizens asking for help. Once they knew he was engaged, and they tell terrible stories of being beaten and hungry, and the staff drinking the coffee and they don't get any coffee. And,
And to this day, this gentleman, when he eats, we have to watch him carefully because from his experiences, he doesn't even chew. He just shovels. He's choking
yeah,
from his days
the
of
fear of not getting enough. Yeah. Wow.
or being taken away or whatever they did.
Whatever they did. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned towards the end that the vision that these reformers had has yet to be realized. What are some of the parallels you see between mental health care at that time and mental health care today?
Well, Sue Abderholden of NAMI would be a much better person to answer that, but the core issues are, where do people live, and what kind of treatment do they need and do they get? And one of the challenges is when patients are resistant to treatment or they don't take the meds because they don't like how they make them feel, and then they become homeless or violent. It's the conundrum that was faced in 1940s that is exactly what's happening now under different circumstances. When you say, well, we need institutions again, people go crazy because they knew how bad they were. And is that worse than sleeping on the streets and tent encampments? I drove by a huge tent encampment yesterday in Minneapolis, and a lineup for food shelf that was 3 blocks long. I mean, I don't have the answer, but we never solved the problem. Angela said, let them just have places where they can live and manage themselves. That was her dream. Not big hospital places, but homes. And, the group home concept is probably the closest you get to that, right? And maybe the best.
These guys live in a beautiful home in the county I work with. They have 8 houses and they each have a beautiful brand new house and full-time 24-hour staff.
Yeah.
We're all very well trained and
Yeah.
educated and
And who sponsors it?
I suppose that there's some private pay. And
Yeah.
There's some, that's coming from the legislature.
Yeah, some welfare money and things like
And
that.
some of them have more money than I'll ever, so,
Yeah, so there isn't a clear answer. And Minnesota is now sort of the middle of the pack, a little better than average, at least in terms of the data that the, NAMI and other organizations put together.
Thanks for your talk, Professor Foote. I have a question that's maybe more like historians type of question, so I want to get your take on it. And it's about, say, a broad interpretive framework when looking at state mental hospitals or insane asylums, as they used to be called. You painted sort of a dark, bleak picture of Rochester State Hospital, and I'm not disputing that. And that was a dark time, I think the mid 20th century, when we have these interventionist therapies and lobotomies and
Yeah,
insulin therapies,
Yeah.
electroshock therapies. And we get these reforms in the late 40s and 50s or efforts. Would you, I don't know, looking at the whole, let's say, trajectory of state hospitals, mental hospitals from 19th century onward, is that like a tale of woe and a veil of tears, or is it a mixed bag? Or and maybe a subset question is, when you say Minnesota was one of the worst, what made it one of the worst? And are you talking about within the context of Minnesota or nationally?
well, I won't be able to remember all your questions if I start from the last one and then you can remind me. Actually, the intentions were really positive. The concept of these large institutions was to get people away from the social influences that were harmful to them and into an environment that was self-sufficient and intended to be very protective. That was the goal. That was the thought. And they also believed that would cure, that was the cure. So these large institutions and that was going to cure people, and it didn't work. That doesn't cure people, taking them out of their homes and putting them in a different place. And then when they get overcrowded, and then when it's a substitute for, long-term care for people, you have a zero chance of making it better. And then the war comes and the depression and there's not enough money and the pay is bad and, the men's.
It's kind of like you said, though, the state took over. The people, when they got admitted,
Yes, they became a ward of the state.
yeah.
Yeah,
so the family couldn't do much.
the family couldn't do much. And sometimes they could get them out, but then they were back to the same problem they had. So you had a lot of poverty anyway because of what was happening for 20 years of war and depression. And then you have a vision of just moving people and having the farm and the sewing room and everybody self-sufficient. And that didn't cure anybody. So then you get cynical. And then the cynicism took over, and I mean, this is sort of a layman's guess, but there were differences from hospital to hospital. And, you know, Rochester might have been marginally better because they had a superintendent who knew how to get more money. You know, so it's hard to say beyond, and you know, there weren't a lot of therapies, and psychiatry was in its infancy. And there were, you know, in medical school, they didn't want to be in those places. You know, the doctors didn't want to be there. They wanted to be, you know, treating patients in places where they had treatments that they could succeed at, you know. So it's a whole combination of social, political, and economic factors that I think Minnesota was no different. You know, these theories about, you know, the big institution, that's why they're not in cities for the most part. They're, you know, away from those evil influences of alcohol and, you know, bad things. So, yeah, not a very good answer, but I think
That's
it's,
a good answer.
And just to clarify, you said Minnesota was the worst, we wanted to know if that was.
Oh.
listed.
that was a United States Public Health Service survey that was done in 1940. And worst really had to do with money, so that, you know, the budgets for food and for, you know, other things were so low that, you know, the quality of the institution was rated on a whole series of factors. And that's why it was among the worst, and that was generally agreed, but I think it had to do with hideous overcrowding and not enough money. And no real way of helping the people who were in there.
Some of your assumptions, though, aren't exactly accurate. Institutions had a lot of problems, no doubt, but sometimes that was the only place available for inside.
Yes,
So if they didn't go to the institution, then they were in the community. Those were not better conditions.
no,
The other idea, working a farm, working a job, is actually treatment. And it's a very positive form of treatment. Gives people a sense of responsibility, sense of hope, sense of normalcy. Some of your assumptions aren't exactly accurate.
well, it is true, and I didn't say this, that some of the people had jobs that they had been trained to do on the outside. And there's some information in the book of the sewing room and the people in the sewing room. But the people who were carrying water up you know, up 3-4 flights of stairs in buckets and things like that,
But wasn't that true also in almost every other hospital of that time?
oh, in the mental hospitals, but not
All the hospitals. I mean, unfortunately, the
only.
level of care in the early days of any hospital system is not at all what it is now.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So again, that carrying water up the stairs, that's not necessarily a fault of a psychiatric hospital. That's just the system that any hospitals at that time. I mean, there wasn't running water in 1890.
No, but there was in 1950.
I don't think the patients were carrying water up and down the stairs in the 1950s, so.
So, yeah, I mean, I have some photographs and descriptions of
Okay.
the,
I mean,
The
I
work
didn't
that
see
they
it when
did.
I was there,
yeah,
you know? Most of the patients sat around a lot.
yeah. Well, at a certain point in the 50s, the drugs were pretty much kept everybody sitting around. But they did, you know, if they enjoyed the work, made them feel good, probably so, but, you know, so there's nothing wrong with what you said. But I don't think they were all joyful and feeling part of this great community that they were contributing to.
Oh, I didn't say that.
Yeah. Yeah,
I worked at Moose Lake State Hospital in 1965 to 66.
And I was hired because I was a very progressive young hospital administrator who was starting some new things.
Yeah,
My husband changed jobs, and so I left after a year, but they were starting a sheltered workshop. They had, I remember one young woman worked because she had done some clerical work. They had her work in the rehab office that I was a part of. We had a rather progressive Chinese doctor who came from Menninger. And so I felt that they were offering adequate care and looking forward to, I worked mostly with short-term patients. I developed a program helping them prepare to go home. And so it was a rather progressive.
yeah.
Attitude.
And some of the reforms of the 40s, you know, when they were
Led to that.
operative, they had parties and dances and newsletters and really tried to, you know, create a sense of community with people and that social life was possible, you know. So there were well-meaning efforts. In the 60s, in fact, I met with a group of men who were worked at Fergus Falls in, you know, those around the time they started closing the institutions. And they were tearful at the closing of the institutions because they knew that people were going off to places where they weren't going to get the same kind of care. And it was, these guys were, you know, after they trusted me after, you know, I wasn't just this professor coming to criticize whatever it was they did, you know, and it was pretty touching. So, and maybe in the 60s, it was a little better because some of those reforms had happened and more money was coming in. But Moose Lake stayed open longer than some of the others. Yeah. And was later, because in the time I'm talking about, it wasn't one of the hospitals. Yeah.
You had a question.
Oh, yeah, so I tried to recently do some family history. My great uncle, passed away in 67, but he spent the majority of his life at, St. Peter, Rochester State Hospital, and he was at Anoka as well. I called St. Peter, the records office, and they destroy records after 30 years, so there was no way, and I wasn't interested in reading all of his history. I was just curious, you know, what type of mental illness did he have? There's no one left in my family to really tell me.
Yeah.
And I find out though, from talking to the county records office in Nicollet County, where St. Peter is located, different dates of his death certificate reads he had pneumonia, but he had tuberculosis. And he had tuberculosis the majority of his adult life. So was there a component of mental illness? Probably, but he had TB also. So he was being treated at different institutions, I believe, for tuberculosis. But I was just curious, you know, what type of mental illness did he have? And I don't know if I could ever find out.
Well, the records, I don't know what St. Peter did, but the Minnesota Historical Society, and there's someone here who might want to tell you what she's recently done, but you can get records from some institutions, including Rochester, if you have enough information so that they can identify the patient.
Yeah.
And it costs $20 or $5.
Well, what I did, I'm writing a book about my family and found it's not blood relative, but it's step, you know, sons. Ended up in St. Peter, because I go through newspapers.com and had the New Ulm, you know, record of that he got admitted. So I contacted the Minnesota Historical Society
And for $5, I sent in and they gave me the identification card, which gives you that yes, he was there. And then you can go a step further and pay $20 to the Minnesota Historical Society, and hopefully you'll get your records. Mine was, he died in 1920, so I don't know what your dates are.
Yeah, well, he passed away in 67, but I was just curious, there's a family story, but I was so surprised to read he had tuberculosis, and that was a continuing diagnosis, admitting diagnosis for different times. He was here in Rochester and at St. Peter and at Anoka. So I was kind of surprised about that. So he was being treated for that, but he had to have there was some other mental illness component to it.
Well, thank you. I believe you do have, if anyone's interested in the book, she does have, Professor Foote does have books, if you would like, to purchase one of those, or if you wanna take a look at the cameras all over there. Otherwise, thank you again for coming, this was fantastic. I know I learned a lot, so thank you.
I wanted to kind of speak up, yet, things with mental health tend to be financial or stigmatized so
Yes.
easily. I have my youngest sibling,